The city of Vienna was dying. It was September 1683, and for 2 long months the Ottoman army had surrounded it like wolves circling a wounded deer. The once proud capital of the Habsburgs now looked like a smoking ruin. Cannon fire had chewed through its walls. Disease and hunger gnawed at the people inside. And beyond those walls, in every direction, stretched the endless sea of the Ottoman host, perhaps the most terrifying force Europe had ever seen. Tents stretched for miles, glittering like a moving city. The banners of the Sultan fluttered above them, crescents gleaming in the sun. Over 100,000 men stood ready to storm Vienna, sipahis, janissaries, auxiliaries, and engineers who dug ceaselessly, tunneling under the walls to blow them apart. Their commander, Grand Vizier Kara Mustafa Pasha, believed the city was already his. He had promised his master, Sultan Mehmed Thur, that the crescent would rise over St. Stephen's Cathedral, and that Vienna would fall like Constantinople before it. Inside the walls, people prayed not for victory but for survival. They knew no help was coming. The emperor himself had abandoned the city and fled. Vienna was abandoned by its own rulers. The defenders were few, their food almost gone, their bodies ravaged by dysentery. Men fought with desperation, women carried stones to the walls, even children ran messages through the smoke and fire. But deep down, everyone knew the end was near. And then a rumor began to spread. Far to the north, across the hills and forests, someone was coming. Not an army of the Habsburgs, not the half-hearted allies who had squabbled while Vienna starved. No, the Poles were coming. Their king, Jan III Sobieski, had answered the call. He had marched across Europe with a ragtag coalition of soldiers, priests, peasants, and nobles, dragging cannons across mountains, burning with faith and fury. He was not just coming to help Vienna. He was coming to decide the fate of Christendom. And when he arrived, he would lead the largest cavalry charge in human history, a thundering tide of horse and steel that would smash into the Ottoman army and change the world forever. This is the story of how the King of Poland destroyed the might of the Ottoman Empire at its very peak and saved Europe at the very edge of defeat. To understand why this battle mattered so much, we need to step back and look at the world as it was in the late 1600s. For centuries, the Ottoman Empire had been the unstoppable giant of the East. Born out of the ashes of Byzantium, it had swallowed lands across 3 continents. At its height, it stretched from the deserts of Arabia to the plains of Hungary, from the walls of Baghdad to the gates of Morocco. To Christians in Europe, the Ottomans were more than just a rival power. They were the terror at the edge of the map, the empire that seemed destined to consume everything in its path. And their rise had been relentless. In 1453, they captured Constantinople, the great jewel of the East. The fall of that city shocked Europe. The mighty walls that had stood for 1,000 years crumbled before Ottoman cannons, and the Byzantine Empire, once the guardian of Christianity, was wiped from the earth. From that moment forward, the Ottomans seemed invincible. Over the next century, they pushed farther and farther into Europe. Serbia, Bosnia, Bulgaria, Greece all fell under their rule. Hungary was crushed at the Battle of Mohacs in 1526, where an entire Christian army was destroyed in a single afternoon. Ottoman cavalry swept across the plains, their banners planted in the heart of Central Europe. And soon after, they came for Vienna. In 1529, Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent himself led an army to the gates of the Austrian capital. The siege shook the continent. This was the first time Ottoman cannons thundered outside Vienna's walls. The city barely survived, saved only by the rain and mud that bogged down the Sultan's artillery. But even though the Ottomans retreated, the memory of that siege haunted Europe. It was a reminder that the empire could come back at any moment and finish what it had started. For the next 150 years, the frontier between the Habsburgs and the Ottomans became a constant battlefield. Raids, skirmishes and wars bled the land dry. To peasants in Hungary or Transylvania, life was a nightmare. Burned villages, stolen children dragged off to become janissaries, endless taxes demanded by both Christian kings and Ottoman pashas. The borderlands were a graveyard of empires where no one truly won and everyone suffered. But by the 1680s, the Ottomans were ready for another great push. Sultan Mehmed IV had grown restless. The empire was still strong, but cracks had begun to show. Corruption ran through the provinces. Janissaries muttered about pay, and rival powers like Persia threatened the eastern frontier. The Grand Vizier, Kara Mustafa Pasha, believed he knew the solution. Strike west, take Vienna, and prove to the world that the Ottomans were still the masters of destiny. And Vienna wasn't just any city. It was the key to Europe. If the Ottomans took it, the road to the heart of the continent would lie open. From Vienna they could march into Germany, into Italy, even into France. The Holy Roman Empire would collapse. The balance of power would shatter. Europe itself could be reshaped under the Crescent banner. And there was another reason Kara Mustafa wanted Vienna so badly: glory. The Grand Vizier was an ambitious man. He dreamed of not just serving the Sultan, but of carving his name into history. He wanted to rival Suleiman, the great conqueror who had once stood outside the same city. If Kara Mustafa could do what even Suleiman had failed to accomplish, he would become a legend. His prestige would be unmatched, his enemies silenced, his position unshakable. So in 1683, he gathered one of the largest armies the empire had ever assembled. Reports say over 100,000 men, Turks, Tatars, Bosnians, Wallachians, Egyptians, and more. A mosaic of peoples united under the Ottoman banner. With them came massive cannons, engineers trained in the art of siegecraft, and cavalry that had crushed armies before. The Habsburg Emperor Leopold I panicked. He knew Vienna could not withstand such a force alone, and so, rather than lead the defense, he fled the city with his court, leaving the civilians and a skeleton garrison to face the storm. The siege began in July. For 2 long months the defenders clung to life, while the Ottoman war machine dug, blasted, and battered its way closer and closer to the heart of the city. By September, the walls were crumbling. Starvation gnawed at the people. Death was everywhere. But then came a desperate cry for help. The Pope himself, Innocent XV, called for a holy league to save Vienna. He begged Catholic rulers to put aside their rivalries and unite against the common enemy. Some ignored him. Some dragged their feet. But one man answered with speed and fire: King Jan III Sobieski of Poland. And with him the fate of Europe shifted. When Europe called for help, the man who answered was no ordinary king. Jan Sobieski was a warrior king in the old style, a man forged in battle, respected by his soldiers, and feared by his enemies. To his people, he was known as the Lion of Lekistan, Lekistan being the old name for Poland. And when the lion roared, armies trembled. Sobieski wasn't born into greatness. He was born in 1629 into a noble but not royal family. Poland at that time was part of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, a sprawling state that stretched from the Baltic to the Black Sea. It was one of the largest countries in Europe, a patchwork of cultures, faiths, and languages. But it was also plagued by constant wars. To be Polish in the 17th century was to live with the sword. As a young man, Sobieski studied at the University of Krakow, but books alone couldn't hold him. He was drawn to the field of war, and he soon proved his worth. Against the Cossacks, against the Swedes in the deluge, against the Russians, against the Tatars, Sobieski fought them all. One battle in particular shaped his legend. In 1673, at the Battle of Kotin, Sobieski led Polish forces against the Ottomans themselves. Outnumbered, his cavalry smashed through the Turkish lines in a whirlwind of steel and horseflesh. The enemy broke and fled. The victory was so complete, so stunning, that when the Polish king died shortly after, Sobieski was elected king by the nobles. He wasn't chosen for royal blood. He wasn't chosen for diplomacy. He was chosen because he was a warrior, the kind of king Poland needed in a world where enemies pressed in from all sides. Sobieski had something few rulers possessed, the full devotion of his soldiers. He lived among them, marched with them, shared their hardships. He was no distant monarch issuing orders from a throne. He rode at the front, saber in hand, his mustache bristling in the wind. When Sobieski fought, his men believed victory was certain, and above all, Sobieski commanded the most feared cavalry in Europe, the Polish winged Hussars. These were no ordinary horsemen. They were the elite of the elite armored knights in an age when knights had all but disappeared. Their lances were as long as small trees, their armor gleamed, and most famously, they wore great wooden frames on their backs, decorated with wings of eagle, swan, or goose feathers. When the Hussars charged, those wings whistled in the wind, creating a terrifying roar that echoed across the battlefield. Enemies swore it was like the sound of thunder. To face a Hussar charge was to face death itself. Again and again, these horsemen had shattered armies many times their size, and Sobieski was their master. By the 1680s, Sobieski was not only king, but one of the most experienced commanders alive. He had fought Tatars in the steppe, Ottomans at the frontier, and Swedes in the north. He knew the terrain, the tactics, the strengths and weaknesses of every enemy. And he knew Vienna mattered, because if Vienna fell, Poland would be next. The Ottoman Empire's expansion wouldn't stop at Austria. The fertile plains of Poland lay just beyond. Sobieski understood that if Vienna was taken, Poland would be exposed. His kingdom, his people, his family, all would be at the mercy of the Sultan's armies. So when the plea for help came, Sobieski didn't hesitate. He didn't waste time in councils or debates. He swore to defend Christendom, to defend Europe, and to defend his own homeland. And then he did what he did best. He saddled up, rallied his Hussars, and prepared to ride. But Sobieski wasn't riding into just another war. He was about to ride into destiny. When word reached Warsaw that Vienna was under siege, the Polish court was split. Some nobles grumbled that it wasn't Poland's problem. Why risk blood and treasure for another kingdom's city? After all, the Commonwealth had its own problems. Cossack uprisings, Tatar raids, constant border wars. Poland was always fighting somewhere. But Jan Sobieski silenced the doubts. He stood in front of the Sejm, the parliament, and declared that Vienna's fall would mean Poland's destruction. The Ottomans wouldn't stop at the Alps. They would sweep into Hungary, into Poland, and then into the heart of Europe. To save ourselves, Sobieski argued, we must save Vienna. His words carried weight, but words alone wouldn't win the day. He had to move fast. Every week that passed meant more starvation in Vienna, more breaches in its walls, more of Kara Mustafa's artillery pounding the city into dust. Sobieski summoned the army. From every corner of the Commonwealth, knights, nobles, and peasants gathered. The winged hussars polished their lances. Mercenaries and infantry strapped on armor and sharpened blades. Across Poland, church bells rang as men rode west, banners snapping in the wind. The march was grueling. Poland lay hundreds of miles from Vienna, and the roads were rough. Summer heat beat down on them by day, and cold mountain winds whipped at them by night. Yet Sobieski rode at the front, pushing his men onward. His presence inspired them. If their king endured it, so could they. On the way, Sobieski formed alliances. Emperor Leopold had fled Vienna, but his generals and nobles begged for Polish aid. German princes sent their contingents. The Pope himself, Innocent XV, had rallied Christendom, urging Catholic rulers to unite. By the time Sobieski crossed into Austria, his army had swelled with allies from Bavaria, Saxony, and beyond. It wasn't easy. Rivalries simmered. German nobles looked down on Poles. Some resented Sobieski being placed in overall command. But the crisis was too dire for bickering. Everyone knew that if Vienna fell, there would be no more kingdoms left to argue over. All the while, Vienna was choking. Inside the walls, citizens dug graves faster than they dug wells. Water was scarce. Bread was gone. Soldiers fought day and night, hurling back wave after wave of Ottoman assaults. The walls shook with cannon fire. Families huddled in cellars as their homes collapsed above them. Corpses filled the streets, yet still the city held on, clinging to the hope that relief would come. And then, one September evening, distant riders appeared on the horizon. Dust clouds rose over the hills. The defenders strained their eyes, hardly daring to believe. And then they saw them. Banners marked with the white eagle of Poland, the black double-headed eagle of Austria, the blue and white flags of Bavaria. Relief had arrived. But the Ottomans weren't about to give up their prize. Kara Mustafa had nearly 150,000 men outside Vienna. Sobieski had perhaps 70,000. The odds were brutal, but Sobieski had something no Ottoman army could match. He had the winged hussars. And he had a plan. He would not wait for the Ottomans to break Vienna's walls. He would not sit back and trade blows. He would strike first, hard, fast, decisively. Sobieski chose the hills of the Kahlenberg as his staging ground. From there he could look down on the Ottoman camps sprawled across the plains. Fires burned, tents stretched as far as the eye could see, and siege towers loomed over the battered city walls. It was a terrifying sight, but to Sobieski it was an opportunity. The Ottomans were spread thin. They had grown overconfident after months of siege. Their forces were scattered, plundering villages and cutting down trees for their engines. They thought Vienna was already theirs. Sobieski would teach them otherwise. On September 11, 1683, the Polish king sent a message into Vienna, smuggled through Ottoman lines. "The liberator is near," it read. "Wait a little longer. We are coming." And then on the morning of September 12th, the armies of Europe began to move. Dawn broke over the Kahlenberg Hills on September 12, 1683. The sky glowed pale gold, the mist still clinging to the valleys when Jan Sobieski gave the order. 70,000 men stirred to life. Drums pounded, trumpets blared. The banners of Europe unfurled in the morning wind. Below them, the Ottoman camp stretched across the plain like a sea of white tents, glittering with spear points and crescent flags. From the walls of Vienna, gaunt-eyed defenders watched in silence. They had endured months of starvation, bombardment, and disease. Now, for the first time, they saw hope on the horizon. Hope and thunder. Sobieski knew the stakes. If he delayed, Vienna would fall. If he charged recklessly, his men would be crushed. So he set his plan in motion. He ordered the German and Austrian forces to attack first, striking the Ottoman lines on the left and center. Meanwhile, his Poles would wait, hidden in the wooded slopes of the Kahlenberg, preparing for the final blow. The morning battle was brutal. The Ottomans met the German and Austrian advance with fierce resistance. Janissaries, the elite infantry of the Sultan, stood shoulder to shoulder, muskets blazing, scimitars flashing. Ottoman cannons roared, tearing gaps in the advancing lines. For hours the two sides clashed in a bloody deadlock. Each charge met with a countercharge. Kara Mustafa watched from his command tent. He had expected some relief force, but he had not believed they would come in such strength. Even so, he sneered at their disunity. He thought the Germans would falter, the Poles would arrive too late, and Vienna would collapse before the Allies could break through. But Kara Mustafa underestimated the will of the defenders and the patience of Jan Sobieski. From the hills, Sobieski watched the battle unfold. Dust rose in great clouds. Cannon smoke drifted over the valley. The roar of musket fire echoed like thunder. His men waited in tense silence, the horses snorting, the lances gleaming, the great wooden wings strapped to their backs fluttering in the mountain breeze. They were the winged Hussars, the pride of Poland, the terror of Europe. For over a century, these armored horsemen had smashed through armies many times their size. Their charge was unstoppable, their discipline unmatched. And now, they waited for Sobieski's signal. By late afternoon, the German and Austrian assaults had driven deep into the Ottoman camp, but they were exhausted. The Ottomans fought with fanatical energy, pushing back again and again. The battle was reaching its climax. And that's when Sobieski stood in his stirrups, raised his arm and gave the order. Trumpets screamed across the hills. The forest erupted with sound as thousands of hooves struck the earth. Out of the trees poured the Polish cavalry, sunlight flashing on steel helmets, banners whipping in the wind. At the head of them rode Sobieski himself, dressed in armor, his saber raised high, the great plumes of his helmet streaming behind him. Behind him thundered the winged Hussars, their vast lances angled forward, their wings roaring like a storm. It was the largest cavalry charge in recorded history. 18,000 horsemen thundered down the slopes of the Kahlenberg. The ground shook beneath them. The sound was like the earth itself was breaking apart. The Ottoman soldiers froze in shock. They had never seen anything like it. The charge descended on them with unstoppable force. When the winged Hussars struck, it was like a hammer smashing glass. Ottoman lines shattered. Soldiers were trampled under hooves, cut down by lances, ripped apart by sabers. Panic spread like wildfire. The once proud Ottoman army broke apart in chaos. Sobieski's men rode straight for Kara Mustafa's tent. tearing through everything in their path. Ottoman banners fell, cannons were abandoned, thousands fled for their lives, their camp engulfed in flames and slaughter. From the walls of Vienna, the starving defenders cheered wildly, tears streaming down their faces. They threw open the gates and joined the attack, surging out to drive the Ottomans into the Danube. In just a few hours, the mightiest siege army the Ottoman Empire had ever sent into Europe collapsed. Kara Mustafa, who had sworn to dine in Vienna that night, was forced to flee in disgrace. And at the center of it all, Jan Sobieski stood victorious. The winged Hussars had turned the tide of history. As the sun dipped behind the hills, the battlefield was chaos. The once mighty Ottoman army, nearly 150,000 strong, lay shattered. Camps burned, horses screamed, abandoned tents flapped in the smoke-filled air. The Danube River, once a lifeline, now became a grave as thousands of soldiers tried to swim across in blind panic, drowning under the weight of their armor. Kara Mustafa watched his dream crumble before his eyes. He had promised the Sultan a glorious victory, a triumph that would open the gates of Europe to the Ottoman crescent. Instead, he faced the greatest disaster in Ottoman military history. His janissaries, once proud, were cut down and broken. His cannons, the thunder of the siege, were now captured by the enemy. His army, the pride of Istanbul, was gone. Mustafa fled, abandoning the battlefield under cover of night. He left behind riches, supplies, and the corpses of tens of thousands of his soldiers. The long march back to Ottoman territory was one of shame, not conquest. His soldiers cursed his name. His allies deserted him, and his enemies rejoiced. In Vienna, the defenders poured into the ruined Ottoman camp. For months they had survived on rats, leather, and grass. Now they found piles of food, barrels of wine, silks, weapons, and gold. They feasted like kings, tears in their eyes, unable to believe they had survived. On the battlefield, Jan Sobieski gathered his commanders. He looked upon the devastation and uttered a single sentence, one that would echo through the ages. Veni vidi Deus vicit. I came, I saw, God conquered. It was not just a victory for Poland or Austria or the Holy Roman Empire. It was a victory for Christendom, a blow so devastating that the Ottoman Empire would never fully recover. News of the battle spread across Europe like wildfire. Church bells rang in Rome. In Paris, London, Madrid, and beyond, people celebrated. Sobieski was hailed as the savior of Christendom. The Pope compared him to a new Constantine, a warrior king chosen by God to defend the faith. But in Istanbul, the mood was very different. The Sultan, furious at the humiliation, blamed Kara Mustafa for the disaster. The Grand Vizier had refused to storm the city early, wasting precious time. He had ignored his general's warnings, overconfident in his power. Now the Sultan demanded justice. Kara Mustafa was stripped of his titles and wealth. He was sent back to Belgrade in disgrace, a prisoner of his own empire. In December of 1683, 3 months after his great defeat, the Sultan's messengers arrived at his quarters with a silk cord, the instrument of execution. The once proud Grand Vizier, who had dreamed of dining in Vienna, was strangled to death by his own men. His head was sent to Istanbul as proof of the Sultan's vengeance. Meanwhile, Jan Sobieski returned to Poland as a hero. He was no longer just a king, he was a legend. His charge at Vienna had not only broken the siege, but it had broken the illusion of Ottoman invincibility. For centuries, the empire had been expanding steadily into Europe. Now, for the first time, the tide had turned. The Battle of Vienna was more than a single victory. It marked the beginning of the Ottoman Empire's long decline. From this day forward, they would never again threaten the heart of Europe with the same unstoppable force. Sobieski's name was etched into history. He had done the impossible. With one thunderous charge, he had saved Vienna, saved Europe, and destroyed the ambitions of an empire. The morning after the battle, Vienna was no longer a city waiting to die. It was a city reborn. Its walls were cracked, its people exhausted, but its spirit was unbroken. As the smoke cleared, the bells of St. Stephen's Cathedral rang out, echoing across the battered streets. For the first time in months, the people could breathe. They had survived the storm. But this victory was not just about one city. The world was watching, and what happened on September 12, 1683, would send shockwaves far beyond the Danube. For centuries, Europe had lived in fear of the Ottoman Crescent. The empire stretched across 3 continents, with armies feared for their discipline, skill, and relentless ambition. Time after time, they had pressed deeper into Europe, swallowing kingdoms, principalities, and cities. Now suddenly the spell was broken. Vienna showed that the Ottomans could be defeated, not just on the fringes, but at the very gates of Central Europe. This realization changed everything. In Rome, Pope Innocent V declared the victory divine. He called it proof that God had not abandoned Christendom, and he used the momentum to rally kings and princes into action. From this spark, the Holy League was born, a new coalition of European powers dedicated to pushing the Ottomans back once and for all. The League brought together unlikely allies: Poland, Austria, Venice, and later Russia. These nations had often distrusted one another, even gone to war against each other. But now, with Vienna as the symbol of unity, they found common ground. The mission was clear: drive the Ottoman Empire out of Europe. For the Ottomans, the psychological blow was immense. The Grand Vizier was dead, the army disgraced, and the aura of invincibility shattered. Sultan Mehmed IV faced growing unrest in Istanbul. His empire, which had once seemed unstoppable, now looked vulnerable. Enemies within and without began circling like vultures. Meanwhile, Jan Sobieski's legend grew with every passing day. His charge had saved Vienna, but it also elevated Poland's prestige across the continent. From Paris to Madrid, his name was spoken with reverence. To the French, he was a rival to their own king's grandeur. To the Austrians, he was the savior of their capital. To the papacy, he was God's chosen warrior. And yet, the story of Vienna was not simply one of triumph. It was also the start of something much larger, a century of relentless conflict that would grind down the Ottoman Empire piece by piece. Within weeks, European armies pressed the advantage. They pursued the retreating Ottomans, striking at their strongholds. Cities that had lived under Ottoman shadow for decades began to stir, sensing change. From the Balkans to Hungary, the balance of power was shifting. The victory at Vienna also transformed the way Europeans saw themselves. No longer divided by endless wars and rivalries, at least for a moment, they glimpsed the possibility of unity against a common foe. It wasn't peace, far from it, but it was cooperation, forged in the crucible of survival. In Istanbul, however, the Sultan's court struggled to process the defeat. Whispers of rebellion spread. The Janissaries, once loyal to the empire's glory, were restless. The loss of prestige was not just military, it was spiritual. How could the empire, the self-proclaimed protector of Islam, suffer such humiliation at the hands of a smaller, fragmented Europe? This fracture in faith and confidence was the beginning of the Ottoman Empire's long decline. For centuries they had expanded relentlessly. After Vienna, they would spend centuries retreating. But for now, Europe celebrated. Vienna was safe. The nightmare was over. And a new story was about to begin. One where the Ottomans no longer advanced unchecked, but instead faced a rising tide of resistance. The dust of Vienna had barely settled when Europe began to move. The victory had lit a fire, and for the first time in generations, Christian powers who had squabbled endlessly turned their eyes in the same direction, toward the retreating Ottoman Empire. At the heart of this new coalition was the Holy League, forged by Pope Innocent V. He had seen the danger in a divided Europe, and now he seized the chance to unite kings, princes, and generals under one banner. What began as a desperate defense at Vienna was about to transform into a sweeping counteroffensive. In Poland, Jan Sobieski returned to Krakow as a hero. His ride into Vienna was immortalized in paintings and songs, but Sobieski himself knew the fight was not finished. He urged Europe not to waste the momentum. If they stopped now, the Ottomans would recover. The key, he insisted, was to keep pushing. Austria agreed. For them, Vienna had not just been a city under siege, it had been the gateway to survival. The Habsburg monarchy, humiliated for decades, was suddenly reborn with purpose. Emperor Leopold I, who had fled Vienna at the start of the siege, now returned in triumph. With his capital saved, he threw Austria's full weight into the Holy League's campaigns. The first target was Hungary. For years, most of Hungary had been under Ottoman rule, its fortresses serving as staging grounds for invasions deeper into Europe. But now, with the Ottoman army shattered, the Hungarians rose in revolt. They had seen the cracks in the empire's armor and they wanted freedom. The campaigns that followed were brutal. European forces laid siege to Buda, the jewel of Ottoman Hungary. For weeks, cannons pounded the walls, and men fell in the mud and fire. Finally, in 1686, the city fell. For the first time in over a century, Buda was back in European hands. The liberation of Hungary had begun. The Ottomans fought fiercely to hold their ground, but the magic was gone. Where once their armies had seemed unstoppable, now they were harried, outmaneuvered, and slowly pushed back. One fortress after another fell. The Holy League pressed the attack beyond Hungary. In the Balkans, Venice launched campaigns to reclaim territory lost long ago. On the seas, Venetian galleys struck Ottoman fleets, cutting supply lines and raiding coasts. Even Russia, long on the edges of Ottoman conflicts, joined the struggle, moving against Ottoman strongholds in the Black Sea region. The war was no longer about defense. It was about rolling back centuries of Ottoman expansion. Every victory echoed the same message. The empire that had once terrified Europe was mortal. But the fighting was anything but easy. Each fortress was a bloodbath. The Ottomans, though weakened, were still formidable. Their janissaries fought with stubborn ferocity, and their commanders clung to the dream of reclaiming lost prestige. The struggle dragged on for years, turning Central Europe into a landscape of smoke, mud, and shattered walls. Still, the momentum was undeniable. Step by step, Europe advanced. By the early 1690s, much of Hungary and Transylvania was liberated. The dream of an Ottoman Vienna was dead. Instead, Europe was carving its way into territories the empire had once thought secure. At the heart of all this was the memory of Vienna. Soldiers carried it with them like a banner, a symbol of what had been achieved and what still could be. Vienna was proof that the tide could turn. It gave men hope in the midst of endless sieges and brutal winters. Meanwhile, in Istanbul, the mood was dark. Defeat after defeat shook the empire. The Sultan dismissed generals, executed scapegoats and shuffled advisors, but nothing reversed the decline. The people whispered of betrayal, corruption, and divine punishment. The empire's once proud image as the sword of Islam was tarnished. The longer the Holy League pressed, the deeper the wound cut. The Ottoman Empire, which had expanded for centuries like an unstoppable tide, was now shrinking, and Europe was watching with hungry eyes. The war reached its climax in 1697 at the Battle of Zenta, where the Ottomans suffered one of their most catastrophic defeats. The Habsburg army, under Prince Eugene of Savoy, crushed the Ottoman forces, killing tens of thousands and shattering their last hopes of holding Hungary. This disaster forced the empire to the negotiating table. In 1699, the Treaty of Karlowitz was signed. For the first time in history, the Ottoman Empire formally ceded vast European territories, including Hungary, Transylvania, and large parts of Croatia and Slovenia. It was a turning point. The empire that had once threatened Vienna now found itself on the defensive, losing land and prestige. The victory at Vienna had opened the door, and the Holy League had walked through it, dismantling Ottoman power in Central Europe piece by piece. For Europe, this was more than just a military triumph. It was the end of an era of fear. The shadow of the crescent moon over Central Europe was lifting. Vienna had been the wall that held, and from that wall, Europe surged forward into a new age. The world remembered him as the savior of Vienna, the man who thundered down the hills with his Polish winged hussars and shattered the Ottoman siege, the man who had stopped one of history's greatest invasions and turned the tide of centuries. But for Jan III Sobieski, the years after Vienna were more complicated. Victory had made him a hero across Europe. Kings, emperors, and popes praised his name. Songs were sung of him in distant lands. Painters immortalized him on canvas, with a crown of laurel on his brow and the gleaming wings of the hussars at his back. Yet in his own kingdom, the story was not so simple. Poland at the time was not a united, centralized state like France or Austria. It was a Commonwealth, a vast realm stretching from the Baltic to the Black Sea, ruled not only by its king but also by its nobles, and those nobles guarded their privileges with ferocity. The system was called the Golden Liberty. Every noble, even the poorest, had immense political power. They could elect kings, block laws, and even veto decisions of the entire parliament. It was a beautiful idea of freedom, but in practice, it often paralyzed the kingdom. Sobieski knew this well. He had been elected king in 1674, and from the beginning he struggled to govern effectively. Powerful, noble families resisted his reforms. Foreign powers meddled in Polish politics, bribing nobles to serve their interests. The same system that gave Poland its unique identity also made it vulnerable. And after Vienna, Sobieski faced the bitter truth. Though he had saved Europe, his victory did not strengthen his throne at home. He dreamed of building a dynasty, of securing the succession for his son, so that Poland might finally have stable leadership. But the nobles resisted fiercely. They feared a strong monarchy. They wanted a weak king they could control, not a dynasty that could grow powerful. Sobieski also hoped his triumph might bring lasting alliances. He had fought side by side with Emperor Leopold, but the Austrians quickly turned their eyes to their own gains. They expanded into Hungary and the Balkans, reaping the rewards of victory, while Poland saw little benefit. Vienna had been saved, but Poland's sacrifices were soon overshadowed by Austrian ambitions. This left Sobieski in a bitter position. He had ridden to rescue Christendom, but his own kingdom was still beset by political division and foreign manipulation. As the years passed, Sobieski grew weary. He was still admired as a commander, but he was also plagued by illness. Gout, fever, and exhaustion wore him down. He withdrew more often to his beloved residence at Wilanów Palace near Warsaw, a place of peace and art, where he spent his final years with his wife, Queen Marie Casimir. Sobieski's wife was his great love, a Frenchwoman who had written him passionate letters during their years apart at war. Their correspondence is among the most famous royal love letters in history. In them, Sobieski was not the stern warrior king, but a man pouring out tenderness, longing, and humor. Even as he faced the weight of kingship, he found joy in her words. But love could not shield him from the decline of his realm. He saw the cracks deepening. The nobles bickered endlessly, blocking reforms, undermining authority. Foreign diplomats swarmed the Polish court, each playing their games to keep the Commonwealth weak. And then came the end. In June 1696, Jan Sobieski died at the age of 66. The king who had once led the greatest cavalry charge in history, who had saved Vienna and broken the power of the Ottoman advance, now lay in silence at Wilanów. His death was mourned across Europe. Bells rang in Rome. Poets in Paris hailed him as a new Scipio, a defender of civilization. In Vienna, his name was spoken with reverence. But in Poland, his death marked the beginning of a long decline. The nobles, freed from his presence, resumed their infighting. His dream of a stable dynasty collapsed. His son was never accepted as king. Instead, Poland sank deeper into political paralysis. Within less than a century, the Commonwealth that Sobieski had ruled would be carved up by its neighbors, Russia, Prussia, and Austria, until Poland itself disappeared from the map of Europe. It was one of history's cruelest twists. The man who saved Europe could not save his own kingdom, and yet Jan Sobieski's legacy endured. His charge at Vienna became legendary, a moment frozen in time. Even centuries later, Poles looked back on him as a symbol of their strength, courage, and honor. He was proof that Poland, despite its struggles, had once stood at the very center of world history, shaping the fate of empires. Sobieski was buried in Krakow's Wawel Cathedral, alongside Poland's greatest kings. His tomb still rests there today, a reminder of the man who, for one shining moment in 1683, changed the course of civilization. September 12, 1683, was not just a day of battle. It was a turning point. The clash outside Vienna was more than a contest between armies. It was a moment where the future of continents was decided in the smoke of cannon fire and the thunder of hooves. For the Ottoman Empire, Vienna marked the end of an age. For centuries, the Ottomans had been the terror of Europe. They had marched from Anatolia into the Balkans, seized Constantinople, and stormed the gates of Hungary. They seemed unstoppable, their sultans commanding vast armies, their fleets dominating the seas, their janissaries feared like no other soldiers. But at Vienna, that aura of invincibility was shattered. Never again would the Ottomans launch such a massive invasion into the heart of Europe. Their empire endured for centuries more, but Vienna marked the beginning of a long decline. The dream of conquering Central Europe was gone. The balance of power shifted. In the decades after the battle, Austrian forces pushed the Ottomans back, reclaiming Hungary, Transylvania, and eventually reaching deep into the Balkans. The Ottomans, once on the offensive, were now forced into defense. Vienna was the high water mark of Ottoman expansion in the West, and from there the tide receded. For Europe, the victory at Vienna was a rallying point. It showed that the Ottoman advance could be stopped, that the empires of the West could stand together in common cause. From that moment, the Holy League was formed, a coalition of Christian powers united against the Ottomans. With Poland, Austria, and Venice leading the charge, they launched new campaigns, slowly peeling back Ottoman control in Europe. But perhaps most striking of all was what Vienna meant for Poland. For one brief, blazing moment, the Polish Commonwealth stood at the center of world history. Jan Sobieski was celebrated as the hero of Christendom. His Hussars became immortal in legend. And yet, as we saw, the glory faded quickly. Poland, weakened by internal strife, could not hold on to its position. The kingdom that had saved Europe was later abandoned by the very powers it had defended. Still, Sobieski's triumph could not be erased. His charge became one of the most dramatic military maneuvers in history, studied by generals for centuries. Napoleon admired it. Modern tacticians still marvel at the timing, the precision, and the sheer audacity. It was cavalry at its absolute peak, a moment when horse and rider seemed to become a single, unstoppable force. And there was something else, something deeper. The Battle of Vienna was remembered not only as a clash of armies, but as a clash of civilizations. Europe and the Ottomans had collided for centuries, but this moment crystallized the struggle in myth and memory. In Christian Europe, it became a tale of salvation, of God's hand guiding the defenders. In Ottoman memory, it was a wound, a bitter loss that marked the fading of their golden age. Yet, if we step back, beyond the banners and the myths, we see something even more human. Vienna was not just kings and sultans. It was bakers in the city walls, keeping watch while kneading dough. It was mothers and children hiding in cellars as cannon fire shook the earth. It was farmers pressed into militia, standing side by side with nobles in gilded armor. It was also janissaries, fighting with loyalty and discipline, believing in the glory of their empire. It was Tatar horsemen, spurring their steeds across the plains, swept into a war that would mark the limits of their world. History remembers great names, Sobieski, Kara Mustafa, Leopold, but in the smoke and blood of Vienna, it was ordinary men and women whose choices, courage, and suffering shaped the day. The siege left scars on the city. Entire districts were ruined. Thousands lay dead. But Vienna survived. And from that survival came centuries of cultural flourishing. Music, art, architecture. Vienna would later be the stage for Mozart, Beethoven, and Strauss. The survival of the city shaped the very heart of European culture. And then, there are the stories that linger in legend. That the croissant was invented in Vienna after the siege, shaped like the crescent moon of the Ottomans, so that every bite was a victory. That coffee, discovered among the abandoned Ottoman supplies, became the foundation of Vienna's café culture. Myths perhaps, but ones that show how battles live on not only in politics, but in daily life, in the food, drink, and traditions of a people. So when we think of September 1683, we should think not only of cannons and cavalry, but of how a single day rippled across centuries. Vienna was not the end of Europe's struggles, nor the end of the Ottoman Empire, but it was a hinge of history. A day when one man, Jan Sobieski, led a charge that decided far more than a battlefield. Because if Vienna had fallen, the map of Europe might look entirely different today. The heartlands of Germany and Italy could have been exposed. The Ottoman Empire might have dominated the continent. The Renaissance, the Enlightenment, the revolutions of industry and democracy, all of it might have unfolded under a different shadow. Instead, Vienna held, Europe endured, and out of that endurance came the world we live in. Jan Sobieski once wrote to his wife after Vienna, humbly saying that all the glory belongs to God, but the labor was ours. Perhaps that is the truest way to remember Vienna, not as a clash of absolutes, not as a simple tale of East versus West, but as the story of human beings, flawed, brave, desperate, brilliant, who in one thunderous moment changed the fate of the world. And that is how the King of Poland destroyed the Ottoman dream of conquering Europe, and in doing so, carved his name into history forever.